Hi, I'm James Gardner, host of Your History, Your Story, a podcast for anyone who loves hearing fascinating tales about remarkable people, intriguing topics, and significant historical events. Our hope is to inspire you to uncover and share your history and your story. In this episode of Your History, Your Story, we are pleased to welcome back award-winning author Stephen Puleo. Stephen joins us to discuss his powerful book, Dark Tide, The Great Boston Molasses Flood of 1919, which recounts the gripping and almost unbelievable story of the disaster, which began when a 50-foot steel tank filled with 2.3 million gallons of molasses suddenly collapsed, unleashing a 15-foot high wave that tore through Boston's North End at 35 miles per hour, leaving death and destruction in its wake. Through meticulous research and vivid storytelling, Stephen brings this bizarre historical event and its aftermath to life in a truly unforgettable way. I'd now like to welcome Stephen Puleo to our show. Welcome, Stephen.
Hi, James. Good to be back. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. So, Stephen, we had you here speaking with us. It's got to be over a year ago. We talked about your book, The Great Abolitionist, about Charles Sumner. And we had such a good time while we talked about that book. And while we were speaking, you mentioned about the book that you had done earlier that was called Dark Tide, The Great Boston Molasses Flood of 1919. So I said at that time that I was going to have you back because that is something I heard about probably about 20 years ago, and it fascinated me at the time, but there wasn't a lot of information about it. And then when you mentioned about the book, I thought, let's have him back. So tell us, just to give us a 10,000 foot view of really what was the Great Molasses Flood, and then we'll talk about some more specifics.
Sure. Well, as I said, thank you for having me back. I'm thrilled. Dark Tide was my first book. It's 22 years old this year. It came out in 2003. And so very excited to talk about it and to be able to continue to talk about it. So the Great Boston Molasses Flood, which occurred on January 15th of 1919. So it's 106 years old, the event. And it was a large molasses tank in Boston that contained 2.3 million gallons of molasses that collapsed, disintegrated, and caused an enormous disaster. Flooded that whole Boston waterfront area, killed 21 people, about 150 people injured, many of them very, very seriously, caused enormous property damage across Boston's North End. And it's become quite a story, quite a history, quite an integral part, I'd say, of Boston history. And the interest, I think, in the flood has occurred now that the book's been out across the country. I get emails on this book from all over the place and on this story. So I look forward to digging in a little bit here.
I am too. 1919 sounds like a long time ago, but my dad was actually about 6 months old in January of 1919. So it's not that far back when you think of it.
No, when we say 106 years, that's like a blur in history sometimes. When you look at the changes that have taken place in the 106 years, it's hard to believe it's only a blur, but it really is. And this disaster, I think, which was very preventable, kind of shows you a lot of different pieces of history that I'm sure we'll get into, but some of the big picture history, almost every major event that America is dealing with in this early part of the 20th century touches this story in some way, which I think, for me is like the joy of history. You have an event and wow, not only do you kind of set the scene around the event, not only am I able to do that, but almost all the major issues touch the event in some way. So that was gratifying when I put the book together.
Yeah. So I heard, I may be wrong, but your book was really the first real significant work done on the flood. And can you tell me what inspired you to pick that topic for your first book?
Yeah, so you're right. It was the first and it's still the only adult nonfiction book on the topic. So that's exciting. So I first came across the flood story when I was doing my master's thesis. I have a master's in history, and I focused on Italian immigration to the North End. That's the topic of it, my heritage. And I used Boston's North End as a focal point. And of course, this flood occurs in the midst of the Great Immigration, little bit after it, but sort of in the midst of it as Italians are trying to assimilate and arriving and buying homes and settling in, etc. And when I came across the story, I said, wow, that's incredible. First thing you do when you research is look for a book on the topic, right? So there are no books on this topic. And there were a couple of children's fiction books that were written in the 1980s, late 80s. All of them came at the story from kind of a whimsical perspective. Johnny opens his front door, sees a river of molasses going by, jumps on a piece of cardboard and goes and has a molasses adventure. Like that was the theme of all of these kids' books. But I said, okay, let me dig a little deeper. I look at some of the newspapers on microfilm at the time. There were 7 Boston newspapers. Every single one of them carried the flood story on the front page, probably for about a week. And inside, page after page of feature stories on the flood. And it actually knocks off the front pages the Prohibition Amendment that's in the midst of being ratified, and the Versailles Peace Treaty to end World War I. So those get knocked off with a front page. And I said, I have to do a little bit more work on this. And that kind of, the ball of yarn started unraveling at that point, and that's how I started.
And I couldn't help but think about one of my favorite books is The Johnstown Flood by David McCullough. And I couldn't help but think of there were certain similarities between the two. I think the extent of the damage and the death toll was way, way bigger for Johnstown, but still there's that terrifying factor of a large body of liquid just like devastating everything in its way. It seemed a lot similar that way.
Yeah, it's a great book, by the way. I love that. It's one of my favorite McCullough books. Yeah, I think there are similarities both in that point, the disaster aspect, but also in the possible, the preventable nature of the disaster, right? Both of them, I think, very preventable. Both of them kind of caused by some greed, and that led people to cut corners, which is exactly, what happened in both of the disasters.
Yes, yes. Now you started talking about immigration and things like that. Can you set the stage in this country for that time period, say from 1915 to 1925? What was going on in the country and around the world?
Yeah, and I'm glad you picked that decade, right? Because that's really the narrative of the flood story. So 1915, the tank is built. 1925 is the end of the enormous civil lawsuit court case that the flood spawns, right? Still, I think the largest civil action or the largest consolidated court case, I think you could call it a class action suit today, still in Massachusetts history. So it's huge. So that 10 years is a good period to take. So you have World War I, right, raging in Europe, and I like to say that all these elements touch the flood story. About 95% of the molasses in that tank was further produced into industrial alcohol, and further processed and used in the production of munitions for the First World War. So nitroglycerin, TNT, those kinds of high explosives. Molasses was a protected war industry at the time. And so United States Industrial Alcohol, the company that owns the tank, private company with the words US in it, had as some of its large customers the big munitions plants in the United States, big munitions companies. And before the US gets into the war, the French and British governments are big clients. And then after the US gets into the war in 1917, the US government becomes a big client of US industrial alcohol. So you had that going on. You had a big anarchist movement happening in America at the time. Anarchists of all nationalities, very violent, very active. But the Italian anarchist movement, and I would say kind of the comrades of Sacco and Vanzetti, had as its de facto headquarters Boston's North End. And so there was a lot of explosions and bombs set off at munitions companies. at a police station in the North End, which was bombed in 1916. So around the area, around the Boston, New England area, you had very active anarchist activity. And then it spreads in 1919, shortly after the flood. There are bombs set off simultaneously in 7 cities across the United States, including Washington, D.C., at the Attorney General of the United States home, A. Mitchell Palmer, responsible for some of the Palmer raids and deportations of immigrants. And so, it's a really violent time. And in 1920, just at the beginning of this large court case I referenced, in fact, just as the defense, the company lawyer is presenting his opening statement, a bomb goes off in New York City on Wall Street in front of J.P. Morgan's headquarters and kills 42 people, set by an anarchist. And so that's going on. But why is that important to the flood story? Because U.S. industrial alcohol makes as the cornerstone of its defense that an anarchist dropped a bomb down a vent pipe on the top of the molasses tank, and that caused the explosion. Therefore, they should be absolved of all liability. That was their defense argument. So that anarchist movement and that anarchist activity makes its way through Dark Tide. And then the immigration piece, if I can, because you brought that up, so I just wanted to touch on that. If you look at it, the North End at this time, one of the most heavily congested neighborhoods in the entire country, has about 40,000 people in around a square mile of inhabitable space. About 98% of that population is Italian. Most of the Irish population has moved out, up and out, upward mobility and out. Most of the Jewish population has moved up and out. The vast majority of that 98%, I would say about 60% of those Italian immigrants were not yet citizens. They could not vote. They had very little to say, therefore, about what happens in their own neighborhood. And so this tank, when it's first sited in the North End, when the company first decides to build there, there's barely a whimper, I would say, from the Boston political hierarchy, and actually barely a whimper from the neighborhood itself. And when the tank starts leaking from day one, also very little in the way of outrage or activity at the Boston city level. And even in the neighborhood, there's this sense of foreboding that something's happening down at that tank. It leaks, it moans and it groans when it gets filled. But the neighborhood, the residents of the neighborhood, more or less keep their heads down, work hard, and don't really say much about it. So I think that immigration theme works its way all the way through the book as well.
Yeah, 2 questions. One is about the anarchists, and the other one is about this sort of almost passive neighborhood as far as concern for the danger of this tank and everything like that. What was the goal of the anarchists to be setting off these bombs? Were they mostly Italian anarchists?
So I would say that in places like New York and in the Boston area, yes, they were mostly Italian anarchists. After Sacco and Vanzetti are arrested in 1920, that activity, I think, also continues. That Sacco and Vanzetti case, just quickly, they're arrested for the murder of paymaster in South Braintree, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston. And their subsequent appeals become a cause célèbre all through the world until their execution in 1927. So you had lots of anarchist activity during that period. And I think the goal of anarchists is they are anti-business and they are anti-government, right? That's this sort of, they come from the extreme left and the extreme right and kind of meet in their ideology, which is we don't like either big business or big government, and their goal is chaos and anarchy, and that's exactly what they tried to sow. And it was a very violent time. It's kind of hard for us, I think, to imagine that activity today, but it was harrowing at the time.
I bet it was. And as far as the people in the neighborhood not really complaining too much, would part of that be the fact that Italians were being employed by the U.S. Industrial Alcohol? Yeah. Were they being employed by them?
Yeah, I mean, not so much. Most of them were laborers who worked nearby because the victims, for the most part, were Italian laborers and Irish city workers. USIA has a very small workforce at the tank site. They do have a larger workforce about a mile away at their processing plant. I would say kind of highly sophisticated processing plant, turning molasses into industrial alcohol. Normally in peacetime, industrial alcohol used for things like dyes, lacquers, turpentine, things of that nature. No, I think the most of the reticence of Italian Americans to speak up is they had a great mistrust of government when when Italy is first unified in 1860. Right prior to that, you had the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies in the south. You had the Papal States around Rome. You had the Bourbon States up north. Garibaldi unifies the country in 1860, and just around the time of the American Civil War, there's no Italy until then. Italy as we know it, right? So he unifies the country. There's a great deal of prejudice by Rome and by the Northerners, who are far more educated, far more cultured, far more wealthy, against the Southern Italians. And that pizza versus polenta rivalry, as it's called, makes its way to Boston. And so that discrimination that Southern Italians face from the government, the official government in Italy, kind of carries over when they come here. There's a lot of mistrust. It takes Italians a long time to become citizens, for example, as a result of this. I use my paternal grandfather, James, as like the quintessential example because he really is. He comes to the country in 1906 from Sicily and doesn't become a citizen until 1931, 25 years later. And in the interim, my grandmother and him have 9 more children. They have a total of 10. They have 9 more children. So they're staying here. There's no question about that. They're kind of committed to building a family here. But that move to citizenship takes some time. And I think that attitude is present during these years kind of leading up to the flood, the 3 years leading up to it after the tank is built.
Okay, now molasses. Let's talk about molasses for a minute. When I think of molasses, I think of rum production is one of the things. And I think about the slave trade and how that might be tied into that in the history of colonial America and beyond. Can you talk to us about molasses and how it was used and its economic history as far as the United States is concerned?
Yeah, sure. And the things you mentioned are exactly right. Molasses was part of the Boston economy for 300 years prior to the flood, used as a sweetener, used to make things like gingerbread and things of that nature. But yeah, on a large scale, it was used to produce rum in Boston much of the 19th century. It's I would say one of the basis materials for that. And as part of the slave trade, you're right, it was part of the so-called triangle trade, where Northeast, I would say Boston, New York, Rhode Island would send rum to the west coast of Africa. That would be traded for slaves. Those slaves were then taken to Cuba, the West Indies, Puerto Rico, where they used sugarcane. Molasses is the boil off of sugarcane, right? So sugarcane was grown and harvested and produced, and then that molasses was shipped back up to the Northeast. And that's the triangle slave trade. That was a huge part of the economy, I would say from about the very late 1600s, right up until the Civil War. Maybe not quite as extensive during the 1840s and 50s, but right up until the Civil War, that was part and parcel of it. And then rum production is a huge part of the usage of molasses. And then, as I said, during the war period, molasses is then produced into industrial alcohol. There's other reasons for it. But during the war, it's used in munitions production.
That was one of the biggest surprises reading your book, was about the molasses being used for munition production. That was a big surprise, but I was trying to follow the flow of this, no play on words there, the flow of the molasses. Where was the molasses coming from that was arriving in Boston?
It comes literally from Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the West Indies, those 3 areas. And think of this, these big molasses steamers would come up from those areas. Think of them as oil tankers, except in their holds, it's molasses. So They would hold 700,000, 800,000 gallons of molasses, and some of the newer, more modern ships, 1 million gallons of molasses. And so these were regular deliveries. U.S. Industrial Alcohol had molasses storage tanks up and down the East Coast, Cape May, New Jersey, Virginia Beach, Brooklyn, and in Boston. They're siting in Boston. Boston's Inner Harbor, a perfect location for it. And as I said, their industrial alcohol plant was about a mile away. So think of this molasses tank in Boston Harbor as almost a holding tank. Molasses gets offloaded into the tank, and as needed, and it was needed a great deal, molasses gets transported to the industrial alcohol factory by rail cars, like an oil car, if you will. That's how it gets. So there's rail traffic that runs along the street right near the tank. Perfect location for USIA. So it's a perfect location geographically and a perfect location politically, because there's no resistance when they build it there.
Got it. The tank is built right next to the water, right? So the ships can pump it right into it?
Correct. About 200 feet. This tank, about 200 feet from the water. Large intake pipe goes from the ship to the tank.
Okay. Now let's talk about the tank and its construction. So it's the U.S. Industrial Alcohol Company that's the parent company that builds this thing. Can you talk to us about who was in charge? The man in charge, I believe, is a man named Arthur Gell, that you talk about a lot in the book. Could you tell us about him and the pressures that were on him in building that tank quickly?
Sure. Arthur P. Gell is the treasurer of United States Industrial Alcohol, and I'm sure a very good finance guy. The problem is he's put in charge of the construction of this project, launching this project in the fall of 1915, to have this tank ready by New Year's Day, 1916, for the first tanker to come up. And the tank is rushed to completion. Steel is delivered in the tank for the tank's construction that is below specifications. And Gell has no architectural, no technical, no kind of construction experience whatsoever. And he's put in charge of this and doesn't really ask anybody, doesn't know much about the factor of safety, about how strong this tank should be constructed. Rushes the tank to completion. I'm talking 24-hour construction. There was lots of talk in the testimony about electric lights at the site to allow that construction to continue. One worker dies during construction. And so think of this tank as a series of steel plates. It was built what was called lap joint construction. So one steel plate overlaps another and is held together by thousands of rivets. That's how the tank is built. That's how the tank is constructed. And when those tanks are properly constructed, number one, the thickness of the steel is sufficient. And number two, the work with those rivets in order to ensure what builders call plumbness, if you will, so that those things line up and they're perfectly sealed. Those are usually done well. That was not the case with the Boston molasses tank. It was very shoddily constructed. And Gell really does nothing, I would say, to improve that. Now, he's under a great deal of pressure to meet these quotas from U.S. Industrial Alcohol. So even when the tank starts to leak, and he's warned about it by his own employee, he basically tells the employee to be quiet, and because this work has to continue. And what he ends up doing is he ends up having the tank painted from a steel blue color to a brownish red color, which is the color of molasses, in a sort of lame attempt to camouflage the leaks, which does not really work. People talk about it. Yeah, we still saw them coming down the side. And then I think the last real big mistake he makes is part of the contract calls for the tank to be filled with water when it was completed, to at least test for leaks, if not for weight, at least for leaks. And he testifies in court later that the company has neither the time nor the money to do that. And they fill this 50-foot tall tank with 6 inches of water. They take it up past the first angle joint at the very bottom, and he pronounces it ready to use. So Gel is really the villain of the book, and I think justifiably so.
I definitely think so because actually, when you think of most manufacturing companies, there's often finance people arguing with the engineers as to, what's good enough, what's too expensive, what's quality enough, and back and forth. But when you've got the same person wearing the same hat and they don't really understand the engineering piece of it, what could go wrong, right?
Yes, I think that's right. And one of the things that comes out in court is this whole factor of safety point, which to just make it really simple, you're basically normally for these kinds of tanks, you build a factor of safety at a factor of 3, which means that this tank should be able to withstand a projected 3 times as large of the maximum pressure that could be on its outside walls. Gel knows nothing about these factors, doesn't know what a factor of safety is. That comes out. He asked a friend, and the friend said, probably about a factor of 2 is fine. And it comes out in court later that the friend only knew about water tanks, and water is much lighter than molasses. And so Gel kind of goes with that, almost like your buddy tells you something and you don't check it out. And here you build this whole tank with 2.3 million gallons of molasses in it at its capacity. And I think to get your arms around that, James, for those of us who only know molasses through grandma's molasses in the store or something, the lawyers for the plaintiffs in the court case after say that the weight encapsulated in that tank was equivalent to 13,000 Ford automobiles. That's a Model T Ford they're talking about, 2,000 pounds each, times 13,000. That's 26 million pounds that are in that tank, the weight inside that tank. And for a tank that's built poorly, it just couldn't withstand it.
That's a tremendous amount of pressure. And I think you even mentioned the fact that there's some fermentation that's going on between the molasses that was there already plus the new molasses, and that could also create a problem with the pressure inside, right?
Yeah, and in fact, that indeed is what happened. So you're absolutely right. The molasses that's in the tank is basically cold, not frozen, or let's call it room temperature even. 2 days before the flood, there was a delivery of about 800,000 gallons of molasses from a tanker. And that intake pipe that we talked about earlier is usually heated as the molasses is pumped off of the ship into the tank. For the flow of the molasses to go more smoothly, the intake pipe on the tank side is at the bottom. So you have this warm molasses at the bottom mixing with cold molasses, and that does create a fermentation process, very natural. And in fact, they call them manhole pipes, but consider them vent pipes on the ceiling of the tank that's supposed to allow that gas to vent. Sometimes that cold molasses acts as a tamp and kind of pushes that gas down. And so the pressure goes on the outside walls. Now, as the plaintiff's lawyers say, yes, that's very common. USIA should know this and should have built a stronger tank, which they don't do. So that fermentation process, normal. That tamping down process, normal. That pressure on the outside walls as a result of the tamping down process, normal. And the only time that it's an issue is when a tank is not built well. So that was essentially the cause of this tank's disintegration.
Yeah. Now, before we talk about the break itself, the day of the break, you mentioned about an employee of Arthur Gel's sort of sounding the alarm, and I think his name was Isaac Gonzalez. Can you tell us a drop about him?
Sure, Isaac Gonzalez, I think, is one of the heroes of the book, small heroes of the book. He does work for USIA at the tank site. He's a jack of all trades. He sweeps up. He helps the tankers connect their hoses, those sorts of things. He's really on site to kind of watch over the tank. He has premonitions that this tank is going to collapse. He sees the leaks. He hears the moaning and groaning every time there's a delivery. He hears some of the conversation from the city workers in the area. This is right in the middle of kind of a DPW area, and also the area where a lot of produce and product that Boston is exporting overseas and up and down the East Coast, emanates from. So there's all kinds of activity commercial activity on the area, and he hears that talking as well. He's the person that warns Gel and gets threatened, and is the cause of Gel's decision to paint the tank. But also, Dark Tide opens with a prologue of Isaac Gonzalez running through the streets of Boston from his south end apartment to the north end, from one end of the city to the other, basically, at 3 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning during 1918, running onto the tank site, running around back, opening the valve, letting some molasses out into the inner harbor, closing the valve and running home. Because of these premonitions that he had that the tank was going to disintegrate, was going to collapse, which it did, that was his small way of trying to prevent that. And he talks about that extensively in court later, how he tried to do that.
The man had a conscience.
Very much so. Very much so.
Yeah, it's almost like just letting little bits out at least gave him the satisfaction that he did a little something that may, hold this thing off from happening, which it eventually does. So take us to January 15th, 1919.
Sure. So it's a January thaw in Boston. It had been 2 degrees 2 days earlier. It's about 40 degrees now. So it's right around lunchtime, just before lunchtime. The city workers are out. People are around, moving around. There's children home from school during that day. And normally they would go down to the tank site and scoop up molasses that had leaked out of the tank and pooled around the bottom of the tank. This day they were doing a little of that, but they were also collecting firewood down around that area, a couple of children particularly. And a Boston police patrolman by the name of Frank McManus is walking his regular beat, coincidentally, along Commercial Street, and even more coincidentally, was making his routine call on the call box back to Boston Police Headquarters, when he hears what he describes as a tremendous rumbling, grinding sound and the rat-tat-tat of what sounds like hundreds of machine gun bullets. Turns around and sees this tank disintegrating and molasses disgorging, and has the presence of mind to make one of the most unbelievable calls back to Boston Police Headquarters. He says, "Send all available rescue personnel immediately. There's a wave of molasses coming down Commercial Street." They have never had a call like that since, I can guarantee you, James. But that is the official call. And the molasses comes hard and fast. So the term "you're slow as cold molasses" in January does come from this disaster. But this molasses comes out at about 35 miles an hour, at about 35 feet high at its outset. It levels off at about 20 feet high and 160 feet wide. And you need to think of this as a wave, I would say, a mini tidal wave that scours everything in its path, picks up horses, picks up domestic animals, picks up people, picks up small buildings, picks up carts, delivery carts, kegs of beer that are being delivered, all kinds of produce, and picks up horses. There's a municipal stable right near the area. 25 horses, by the way, are killed in the Great Boston Molasses Flood, half from the wave itself, half are shot to death by Boston police that evening, because they're so enmeshed in the molasses that they can't get out. So think of it that way. This molasses destruction occurs for about a mile from the tank southward along Commercial Street in Boston, right along the waterfront, takes buildings, takes this DPW yard with it, ruins the stables, destroys a firehouse it's kind of the waterfront firehouse that was responsible for putting out fires in boats on the harbor. Immediately, there are rescue personnel who are sailors from ships moored in the harbor, who are on the scene, who do their best to rescue people, pull them out when they can, and they have a very difficult time doing it. Boston firefighters are on the scene relatively quickly. They are required to lay ladders horizontally on the molasses to crawl out to pull victims out. Most of them dead. Some of them they were able to rescue. Many of them they were able to rescue. Some of them with very serious injuries. These 150 people who are injured, we're talking about things like broken backs, broken pelvises, fractured skulls as they're hit by this debris that's caught up in the wave. 2 children are killed in the flood of those 21 people. They're both 10 years old. They're both the children of Italian immigrants, Maria D'Estasio, Pasquale Iantosca. Maria's body is found that afternoon. She is literally, the firefighters see her hair swirling on the top of the molasses. And they go out and they pull her out, and she's asphyxiated in molasses. And Pasquale is found about a week later. His father trudges up and down the waterfront looking for any evidence of his son. And they finally find that he has been swept and crushed by a freight car that was running along Commercial Street. And his body's totally disfigured. They're unable to identify him, but for the fact that his mother had dressed him in 2 sweaters that day. And so they knew that was him. He was missing. The size of his body was, appropriate for a 10-year-old. And his mom had dressed him in 2 sweaters. So those 2 Italian immigrant kids is one of the ways I tell the Italian immigration part of the story is through the eyes of the children. Firefighters do their best, as I say, to get as many people out as they can. People who are injured are transported to the nearby Haymarket Relief Station, where it's almost a scene from a surreal movie. Doctors can't recognize if they're men or women because they're covered in molasses. They have to remove molasses from their breathing passages because they can't breathe. There's molasses on the gurneys. These people are put in crude traction devices of the day. And so that's occurring. And meanwhile, firefighters are trying to do their best later in the day, once they're able to pull as many victims out as possible. How does this thing get cleaned up? How do you clean up this mess, this molasses everywhere? At its peak, figure it, James, up to about their hips, maybe a little higher, and then dissipating as you get further away from the tank. And there's really no solution. They hook up their hoses to municipal water supplies. That really doesn't do much good as molasses begins to, I would say, congeal, and it becomes very viscous. It doesn't harden totally, but it does become viscous, I would say, very thick, like thick oil. And so it doesn't do too much good. And by the next day, people are bringing chisels and picks, but that, of course, does no good. There's so much molasses. And finally, one enterprising firefighter has the idea that perhaps salt water from Boston Harbor, the brine of that salt water, would cut the molasses. And that would begin that process. And they do exactly that. They pump millions of gallons of water from Boston Harbor, and they wash a great deal of the molasses away, including into Boston Harbor, much of it. I had somebody at one of my presentations say, how long would the cleanup have taken had we had an EPA then? And I think it would have taken a very, very long time. But that does really a great deal to wash it away. And in some of the buildings across the street that are destroyed, their basements are filled all the way to the first floor with molasses. There are crude hydraulic pumps of the day that are used to remove some of that. So it's a harrowing scene.
What are the total number of casualties that they estimate?
Yeah, there were 21 people killed, 150 people injured. Of that, 119 become, including the family members of the deceased, become plaintiffs in that court case that follows.
One curiosity before we talk about the court case, how long was it until they cleaned up the very, very last of the molasses? Do you have any idea when they might have found pieces or remnant of it in basements or anything like that?
Well, I would say if you look at the cleanup of that North End area, so that would include the molasses cleanup, the rebuilding of a large part of that DPW yard, the repair of an overhead passenger train trestle that was destroyed during the flood. That whole time takes about 6 months. Really, when you think about it, not that long by standards of the day. This is a neighborhood that's devastated. I have a bridge in my hometown that's taken 10 years to reopen. So, you know what I mean? Like when you look at it that way. But in terms of the molasses out of the cellars, the smell of molasses that you hear takes years. So I would say that smell lasts for decades, particularly the smell down in the basements. I've talked to people who were meter readers for the Boston Gas Company in the 1960s. in early 1970s who said when you went into the basements of those buildings, you could still smell molasses. Now, the part of the folklore of the flood is that you can still smell it today. You cannot. The folklore says on a warm day, you can go down and still smell molasses. I can tell you, I've been there on warm days, hot days, cold days, rainy days, snowy days. You cannot smell it. But that's where it comes from, is you could for years afterwards.
That is so interesting. I know there's probably a lot of good storytellers out there who have all sorts of legends and things about the molasses flood. As we're talking, I recall one of the very first times I heard about the flood was probably about 25 years ago. A colleague of mine, he told me that his grandfather was on the Boston Fire Department during the molasses flood. And I'm like, what was that? So I started to research it, and that's when I first heard about it. But let's move on to the court case that followed. First of all, there was a case, there were plaintiffs, it was a big deal. And then there's a man who emerges in the court case by the name of Major Hugh Ogden. Can you tell us about him, and how does this whole thing roll out?
Yeah, so you're right. Hugh W. Ogden is a very prominent Boston lawyer, very strong military background. As you say, he was a major in the First World War. He is asked by the Superior Court to act as, I think we would call him today, almost a court-appointed master, to hear the testimony in this case, do the best job he could, finding the facts, and render some kind of a ruling, some kind of a finding. And that was his job. The Superior Court says, this will probably take you about 6 weeks of your time. It takes 3 years of his time. The molasses flood case is enormous. There are 1,000 witnesses. There are 1,500 exhibits in this case. It is the first use of expert witnesses on both sides. So chemists, metallurgists, architects are used on both sides. Company officials testify, city officials testify, family members of the deceased testify, those who are injured testify. It's really an enormous court case, and a very, very important one, I would say. At the end of it, Hugh Ogden finds against the company. He rules that United States Industrial Alcohol is liable for these damages, for the damages and the deaths and all of that. Is kind of it's a surprising case. There would be no shock had he ruled the other way. It just wasn't a big deal if that happened. There was probably more surprise he ruled the way that he did. And it's such an important case, James, I would say, in history. Really, that's the first major decision against the United States corporation in this era. And if you draw a line in the sand in 1925, when he issues this case and move forward into the late 1920s, into the Roosevelt years, certainly, the whole relationship between government and big business changes. There are far more statutes, far more laws, far more regulations imposed by government on big business as a result of this Ogden decision. Keep in mind, in the Great Boston Molasses Flood, there was no criminal case, even though a grand jury does sit. They find no criminal negligence because there really weren't any laws that governed this kind of construction. The tank itself didn't even require a building permit because it wasn't considered a building, it was considered a receptacle. So if you look at that court case, that changes everything. That whole relationship changes. Now, through the intervening decades, the pendulum has swung sometimes too far one way, sometimes too far the other. Too many regulations, not enough, etc. I think that's true. But I think there's no doubt that it's that molasses flood case that changes that relationship forever. And I think the way it's manifested for us, on a daily basis, is that everything we take for granted in the building construction business, in the construction regulations business, the fact that architects need to show their work, that engineers need to sign and seal their plans, that building inspectors need to come out and look at projects before they're given the green light. All of those regulations stem from the Great Boston Molasses Flood case. They start in Massachusetts and Boston. They ripple across the country relatively fast after that.
So some good did come out of this tragedy then.
Yeah, I use as my analogy, James, that the Great Boston Molasses Flood did for building construction standards what the horrific Coconut Grove fire in Boston several years later did for fire standards. Yeah, some good comes out of both of those tragedies, I think.
Yeah, I think of another tragedy was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory disaster in New York City. I think that was 1911. So it was around the same time. And you had doors that were locked so that the people couldn't leave early and things like that. So you can only imagine how many sort of disastrous situations happened prior to that that maybe went untold, or maybe they weren't as big, but they were equally horrific to the individuals involved. But it's a shame it had to happen, but I'm glad to hear that there were improvements made as far as building construction. And I guess the other thing is that the tank wasn't actually considered a building.
No, that's what I was saying. It didn't require a building permit because it
Okay,
was
that's right.
called a
Okay.
receptacle and not a building. Yes, at the time.
Oh,
So it's basically built with almost no, I would say, municipal oversight. Maybe that's a good way to put it. There were specs in the plans that the company was supposed to follow, but not much oversight and that's because there were no laws. This grand jury, I think, makes the right decision in issuing no indictments because it was difficult to find a law that was violated.
what happened to our Arthur Gel and U.S. Industrial Alcohol? How did they fare after that trial?
Yeah, so I follow U.S. Industrial Alcohol and Gel. Gel, by the way, gets a promotion, I should say, gets moved to New York City company headquarters. But I follow U.S. Industrial Alcohol up to about 1938. And, they're in business. They're producing industrial alcohol for all the purposes we mentioned earlier, turpentines and dyes and that kind of thing. They go through a series of mergers, acquisitions after that, where I kind of lose them. But I should tell you this story that during one of my talks, I hear from a gentleman who worked for a company in the 1960s called the National Distilling Chemical Company. And NDCC did a lot of work for NASA in the 60s and early 70s in a lot of the moon projects. And that's the company that ended up, or an iteration thereof, ended up with U.S. Industrial Alcohol under its corporate umbrella. And he said that the in-house company history was called From Molasses to the Moon. That's how the company's history was written in-house. So pretty interesting little sidebar there.
Oh, it definitely is. And what about these people who were awarded damages, the victims' families, and the people who were injured? Do I understand that some received more than others based on suffering?
You do understand correctly. So Ogden issues damage awards. You're right about that. The damage awards are one of the important sources I use in this book. I broke the seal on them. They had not been used. They had been dormant in an archives for over 80 years. So it was fun to do that. And a damage award gives you a little bit of a story, right? It's a vignette. It tells how much the person earned, because that's a big part of how much money you get in damages, which is true today. What was the person's earning potential? How many children did they have? What did they do for work? How were they injured or killed, etc.? So Ogden issues damage awards for those who died immediately. Let's take Maria DeStasio's family, of about $6,000. So I think if you multiply it by 100 or so, 600,000 today would be about right. These are not large damages. As he points out, these are people of the working class. As cold as it sounds, they don't have this great earning potential. And I should point out that's exactly how damage awards are done today, right? What is your earning potential? And for people who suffered, to your point, for example, like firefighter George Leahy, who was trapped under the firehouse for 4 hours, trying to keep his head above molasses, and he's unable to do so. He dies. He's asphyxiated in molasses. He's under there for 4 hours. His family's awarded $7,500, just $1,500 more because of that suffering. And again, that's not so unusual in how damage awards are handed out. At that point, the plaintiff's lawyers are very, very happy with Ogden's decision, not so happy with the damage awards. They threatened to take the case before a jury, which is their right. USIA wants no part of a jury after Ogden's damages And they go behind closed doors, they negotiate, and they emerge. And the damages that are awarded to the plaintiffs are about twice as much as Ogden originally gave.
Yeah, and then as far as Boston after the flood, the demographics. So the Italian population grows after that in Boston.
Yeah, Italian immigration grows considerably, both in the North End and across Boston Harbor and East Boston, two big Italian enclaves. And that Italian growth goes right up to and after World War II. And it's not till after the Second World War when, Italian American GIs come home and take advantage of the GI Bill, and Italians began moving out into the suburbs of Boston, like many ethnic groups do. And I would say that Italian population begins to really decline in the 1960s and 70s. Boston right now, the North End, still, I would say the Italian enclave in Boston, probably about 35% Italian American. It's kind of a mixed, gentrified community, very expensive to live there. It's on the waterfront. It's a fashionable place to live. Some of the old timers look at these tenements that have been, converted into condos and can't believe how much those condos are worth now. But it's still, I would say, the center of kind of the Italian culture in Boston. Many Italian restaurants, people from all over the world come. And of course, it's also the site of many American Revolution sites. The Old North Church, Paul Revere's house, also in the North End. So you kind of get this combination where people will come, tourists will come, enjoy the American Revolution history, and then enjoy Italian food for dinner afterwards. It's that nice combo.
Well, I love Boston. As a matter of fact, in the fall, I think my wife and I are planning to be up in the Boston area to do some history visits and things along those lines. So maybe we can find the spot of the molasses flood to sort of see if I can smell anything, right?
Well, it's also marked properly now. Just a couple of years ago, there's a really new interpretive sign down at the site. The Boston Harbor Association asked me to edit, and I did. So it's accurate. There's great photos. You should find that pretty easily on the Commercial Street waterfront, and I can give you a list of my favorite Italian restaurants, James.
Oh, I would love that. And, one more comment on your book, Dark Tide, The Great Boston Molasses Flood of 1919. It is such a well-researched book. It's something that really, if you like a good action-packed nonfiction narrative, it's just wonderful reading. So I recommend it.
Thanks so much for the comments. I do appreciate that, James. It means a lot. It's all about the story for me, and I try to tell it in that kind of solid historical way, but also with a solid narrative. So the big picture gets pulled along by the story. I tell my readers, I like you to learn the big picture history in spite of yourselves because you're enjoying the story so much. So thanks for that.
Absolutely. Stephen, this has been a lot of fun. We had a great time. This has just been a fascinating story, and I hope people get your book to find out the whole story.
James, thanks so much for having me. I had fun. Thanks a lot.
I appreciate it. Stephen, have a great day.
Thank you, my friend. Had fun.
All right. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Your History, Your Story. Don't forget to follow us on YouTube, Facebook, X, and Instagram to stay connected. We'd love to hear from you whether you have questions, comments, or a story to share. Until next time, be well and God bless.